What if Dillon Gabriel isn't losing the Browns' quarterback competition because he suddenly became a bad quarterback? What if the real problem is that Cleveland simply has too many quarterbacks, and one of them is about to become the odd man out? Because right now, the Browns' quarterback room is becoming one of the most fascinating situations in the NFL. Deshaun Watson is still in the picture. Shedeur Sanders has created serious momentum. Dillon Green is developing behind the scenes. And then there's Dillon Gabriel, a quarterback who entered this offseason with a real opportunity to prove he belonged in Cleveland. But as the competition has unfolded, the question surrounding Gabriel has completely changed. It's no longer just about whether he can win the starting job. The bigger question is whether the Browns will even have room for him when the final roster decisions are made. And if Cleveland decides that 4 quarterbacks are simply too many, Gabriel could be the player caught in the middle of a competition that has changed faster than almost anyone expected. But the deeper you look into this situation, the more complicated it becomes. This wasn't just one veteran fighting against one young player. Cleveland had multiple quarterbacks competing for a future that remains uncertain. And from the beginning, Todd Monken made one thing clear: the reps were not going to be divided equally. That matters because in the NFL, reps are opportunity. Every time a quarterback works with the first team, every time he gets a chance to operate in a competitive situation, he is building his case. But the opposite is also true. When a quarterback is consistently pushed into the background, he gets fewer opportunities to change the conversation. Monken has made it clear that the distribution of reps can change from day to day, meaning one quarterback receiving fewer snaps during one practice does not automatically mean he is being pushed out. But over time, patterns begin to matter. And the biggest pattern coming out of Cleveland's offseason program is that Deshaun Watson and Shedeur Sanders have handled a significant amount of the meaningful work with the top units. The Browns have experimented with different ways to evaluate their quarterbacks, but the competition has increasingly centered on the players who have been given the biggest opportunities. That leaves Gabriel facing a problem that may have nothing to do with one terrible throw or one disastrous practice. It's a numbers problem. It's an opportunity problem. And in the NFL, sometimes that can be just as dangerous as poor performance. Because the biggest mistake would be to assume that Gabriel's problem is simply that he is playing badly. That is not what the current situation proves. The bigger issue is that his path to meaningful opportunities has become much narrower. In a 3-quarterback competition, a player can still have a clear path to making an impact. But when the room expands to 4 quarterbacks, every decision becomes more complicated. Cleveland now has to decide how many quarterbacks it actually wants to carry, how many developmental players it can afford to keep, and which quarterbacks give the team the best combination of present value and future upside. That is where Gabriel suddenly finds himself in a difficult position. He is young enough to still be developing, but he is also competing against a quarterback with enormous financial and organizational investment attached to him, a quarterback with growing momentum in Shedeur Sanders, and another young player in Dillon Green, who represents a completely different developmental option. So Gabriel is not simply fighting to become QB1. He may be fighting to remain part of the conversation at all, and that is a completely different battle. A quarterback can lose the starting job and still remain extremely valuable. But if the coaching staff believes 2 or 3 players are clearly ahead of him, the entire situation changes. Suddenly, every practice matters. Every opportunity matters. Every mistake gets magnified. And suddenly the idea of a possible trade doesn't sound completely impossible anymore. But then the past came back into the story. During the previous offseason, Dillon Gabriel made comments about the difference between entertainers and competitors. Those comments quickly became part of the conversation surrounding the Browns' young quarterbacks. Many fans interpreted the remarks as a subtle shot at Shedeur Sanders, especially because Sanders had already become one of the most talked about players in the entire football world. Gabriel later explained that his comments were aimed more at media narratives and the way players are portrayed rather than at Sanders personally. But in the NFL, once a quote becomes part of a storyline, it can be almost impossible to erase. Fans remember. Media members remember. And when 2 young quarterbacks end up competing for the same future, every old comment can suddenly sound different. At the time, Gabriel may have simply been explaining his own mindset. But now, with Sanders receiving growing attention and becoming one of the most important players in Cleveland's quarterback competition, those old comments have gained a second life. The irony is obvious. One quarterback talked about competition. The other continued working. And now, the quarterback who was once surrounded by questions about his public profile is receiving praise for his development and earning meaningful opportunities in the offense. That doesn't prove there is bad blood between the two players. It doesn't prove Sanders is trying to push Gabriel out. But it does create a storyline that fans cannot stop watching. Because in Cleveland, this competition has become bigger than one depth chart. It has become a battle over who the organization believes can actually be part of its future. And this is where Shedeur Sanders completely changes the conversation. When Sanders entered the NFL, the story surrounding him was already massive. He had the name, the spotlight, the expectations, and the controversy that followed him throughout the draft process. But once he arrived in Cleveland, none of that was supposed to matter anymore. The only thing that mattered was whether he could learn the offense, process information quickly, and prove that he belonged on an NFL field. And according to the Browns, Sanders has continued to make progress. Todd Monken has praised his development and pointed to the playmaking ability that made him such an interesting quarterback prospect in the first place. The coaching staff has also given him opportunities with both the first and second teams during offseason practices. That matters because a young quarterback can look impressive in a controlled drill, but the real evaluation comes when he has to operate with different players, different situations, and different levels of pressure. Sanders has been put into those situations. He has taken first-team reps. He has worked with the second team. He has been given opportunities to show that his development is moving forward. And every time he does something that earns more trust, the quarterback room changes around him. Because if Shedeur Sanders is improving faster than expected, Cleveland suddenly has a completely different problem. The Browns no longer have a young quarterback they can simply stash in the background and wait on. They have a player who may be forcing his way into the center of the conversation. And that is where Dillon Gabriel's situation starts becoming much more complicated. The more Sanders grows, the more difficult it becomes for the Browns to justify giving every quarterback the same amount of attention. The more trust Sanders earns, the more valuable his reps become. And the more valuable his reps become, the fewer meaningful opportunities may be available for someone else. That doesn't mean Gabriel has been eliminated. It doesn't mean the Browns have made a final decision. But it does mean the competition is no longer standing still. Sanders is moving forward. And when one quarterback gains momentum in a crowded room, somebody else eventually feels the pressure. But the most surprising part of this entire situation is that Sanders' rise may not even be the biggest problem facing Gabriel, because Deshaun Watson changes the entire equation. If this were simply a battle between two young quarterbacks, the situation would be much easier to understand. One develops, one struggles, one earns more reps, the other gets pushed down. But Watson is still part of the picture. And that means Cleveland's most important quarterback decision may not even involve Gabriel directly. The Browns have a veteran quarterback with significant experience and enormous expectations attached to him. They also have a young quarterback in Sanders, who has reportedly made real progress and continues to receive major opportunities. That creates a competition where Sanders can be rising without necessarily becoming QB1. And that distinction is massive. Gabriel could potentially lose ground to Sanders, while Watson remains the player standing between Sanders and the starting job. In other words, the worst-case scenario for Gabriel may not be Shedeur Sanders suddenly becoming the starter. It could be Watson remaining a major part of the plan while Sanders becomes the preferred young quarterback behind him. If that happens, where exactly does Gabriel fit? That is the question Cleveland has to answer. And the answer may ultimately come down to roster construction rather than emotion. NFL teams don't keep players simply because they were once considered promising. They keep the players they believe can help them now or become valuable later. If the Browns decide that Watson and Sanders are their two most important quarterbacks, then the battle for the remaining spot becomes a completely different fight. And that is where the trade question begins to enter the conversation. To be clear, there is no confirmed trade sending Dillon Gabriel somewhere else. There is no official announcement that Cleveland has decided to move him. And any reports or speculation about a possible trade should be treated exactly that way. Speculation. But the idea itself is easy to understand. If a team believes it has too many quarterbacks, it can explore the market. That does not necessarily mean the player has no value. In fact, sometimes a quarterback becomes more valuable to another team precisely because he is buried on a crowded depth chart. Injuries happen every season. Training camps create surprises. Teams lose quarterbacks and suddenly begin searching for anyone with professional experience and developmental upside. Gabriel could become attractive to a team that sees something Cleveland no longer has enough room to develop. The return, however, might not be massive. Young quarterbacks who have not established themselves as starters rarely command huge trade packages. A late-round pick or another minor asset could potentially be enough to make a deal worth considering. But the important point is this: a trade would not automatically mean Dillon Gabriel failed. It could simply mean the Browns created a quarterback room that became too crowded for everyone to receive the opportunities they needed. And if that happens, Gabriel could be the player forced to find his next chance somewhere else. But before any move becomes real, there is one stage that could completely change the story. Training camp is where all of this gets tested. OTAs can create momentum, but training camp is different. The pads come on, the competition becomes more physical. The pressure increases. Coaches get more information. Players who look impressive in the spring can suddenly struggle when the intensity rises. And players who were barely mentioned during the offseason can suddenly explode into the conversation. That means Dillon Gabriel is not finished. Not even close. If he performs well in camp, if he protects the football, if he shows command of the offense, and if he proves he can consistently make the throws the Browns need, the entire conversation can change. That is the beauty and brutality of quarterback competitions. A player can appear to be falling behind for weeks, then produce one stretch of practices that forces the coaching staff to rethink everything. The same is true for Sanders. His momentum is real, but it is not permanent. The same is true for Watson. His experience may give him an advantage, but the NFL has a way of exposing every weakness once the games begin. And for Gabriel, the mission is simple even if the situation is not. He has to make it impossible for Cleveland to ignore him. Because right now, the biggest danger is not necessarily that Gabriel is playing poorly. The danger is that other quarterbacks are creating stronger stories around themselves. That is what makes this situation so fascinating. Shedeur Sanders has changed the conversation, but he has not necessarily ended the competition. Deshaun Watson remains a major factor. Talon Green is still part of the quarterback room. And Dillon Gabriel is standing in the middle of a situation where one roster decision could completely change his career. The old narrative was that Gabriel and Sanders were two young quarterbacks fighting for a future in Cleveland. But the current reality may be much harsher. Sanders has gained momentum. Watson remains a serious contender. The Browns have 4 quarterbacks, and the team has already made it clear that reps will not be distributed equally. So the question is no longer whether every quarterback will receive the same chance. They will not. The question is, who can force the Browns to keep giving them chances? And that is where Gabriel's entire offseason may come down to a few critical weeks in training camp. Because maybe the final twist is that Dillon Gabriel does not leave Cleveland because he was exposed. Maybe he leaves because the Browns simply have too many competing timelines in the same quarterback room. Watson represents the veteran option. Sanders represents the young quarterback whose momentum is growing. Green represents another developmental possibility. And Gabriel represents a player who may need one team to look at him and say, "We can develop this guy." If that team exists, a new opportunity could be waiting. But if Gabriel stays, the path is still there. He just has to fight through a quarterback room that has become far more crowded than anyone expected. And while fans are already debating whether Shedeur Sanders has passed him, the real answer may not come until the pressure of training camp reveals who can actually separate from the pack. Because the Browns' quarterback competition is no longer just about finding a starter. It is about deciding which players deserve a future in Cleveland. That is why every practice rep matters, every throw matters, every mistake matters. A quarterback who receives an opportunity has to turn it into momentum. A quarterback who loses momentum can suddenly find himself fighting for a roster spot before the season even begins. And for Gabriel, that pressure may be greater than it appears from the outside. He does not necessarily need to defeat every quarterback in the room. He may simply need to prove that cutting him would be a mistake. That is a completely different kind of battle. He has to show the Browns that his development is worth protecting. He has to show that he can operate the offense. He has to show that he can make the difficult throws when the defense knows exactly what he is trying to do. And most importantly, he has to make the coaching staff believe that his ceiling is higher than his current position on the depth chart suggests. Meanwhile, Shedeur Sanders has created the kind of momentum that can completely change a rookie's career. The more comfortable he becomes in the offense, the more opportunities he receives. The more opportunities he receives, the more chances he has to impress the coaches. And the more he impresses them, the harder it becomes to keep him on the sidelines. That is how momentum works in the NFL. It starts with one good practice, then another, then a strong performance in a competitive situation. Suddenly, the player who was supposed to be developing quietly is taking meaningful snaps with better players and receiving more responsibility. And once that happens, the entire depth chart begins to shift around him. That may be exactly what is happening with Sanders. But there is still one thing nobody can predict. What happens when the competition becomes real? Because off-season praise is valuable, but it is not the final answer. Training camp will reveal who can handle pressure. Pre-season games will reveal who can perform when the lights come on. And eventually, the Browns will have to make a decision that could leave one of these quarterbacks searching for a new opportunity. If Gabriel dominates his chances, the story changes. If Sanders continues to rise, the pressure on everyone around him increases. If Watson proves he is ready to take control of the offense, the entire competition could look different again. And if Green continues developing, Cleveland may have even more difficult decisions to make. This is why the Browns' quarterback room is so unpredictable. There is no simple answer yet. There is only a growing battle for limited opportunities. And that brings us back to the question that started this entire story. Is Dillon Gabriel really being pushed out? The honest answer is that nobody knows yet. There is no official decision. There is no confirmed trade. There is no guarantee that Sanders will finish ahead of him. But the warning signs are impossible to ignore. The quarterback room is crowded. The reps are limited. Sanders has gained momentum. Watson remains a major factor, and Cleveland will eventually have to decide whether carrying 4 quarterbacks is worth sacrificing roster space somewhere else. If the Browns decide it is not, Gabriel could become the most logical player to move, not because he failed, not because his career is over, but because the team may simply believe another organization can give him the opportunity that Cleveland no longer has room to provide. And maybe that is the real irony of this entire situation. Dillon Gabriel could enter training camp fighting to prove he belongs in Cleveland, only to discover that his best opportunity might be somewhere else. Shedeur Sanders could enter the season as a rookie, trying to prove the critics wrong, while suddenly becoming one of the most important players in the Browns' future. Deshaun Watson could remain the veteran, standing between Sanders and the starting job. And Dillon Green could quietly continue developing while everyone else fights for attention. 4 quarterbacks, limited roster space, one organization trying to find stability at the most important position in football. So no, Dillon Gabriel is not officially finished in Cleveland, but the margin for error may be getting smaller. Shedeur Sanders has changed the conversation. Deshaun Watson has complicated the entire competition. And the Browns may soon have to make a decision that affects multiple careers at once. The next few weeks could determine whether Gabriel remains part of Cleveland's long-term plan, becomes a trade candidate, or forces his way back into the conversation with one of the strongest training camps of his young career. Because in the NFL, a quarterback can be one decision away from being forgotten, or one opportunity away from changing everything. And if Dillon Gabriel gets that opportunity,